All right, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Apologies, so the video is playing on the background. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are tuning in from. Thank you so much for joining today's conversation, co-hosted by the Alliance for Peacebuilding and the Institute for Economics and Peace, forming consensus on where and how to tackle increasing ecological threats globally. Findings from the 2023 Ecological Threat Report. My name is Nick Zarowski. I'm a manager for policy and advocacy here at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, like I said, I'm with AFP. We are a membership-based organization. We're made up of more than 200 peacebuilding organizations that work in 181 countries. And our goal as an organization is to build and advance the peacebuilding field, because we know that complex challenges like violent conflict and fragility will never be solved by one organization alone. Now, AFP really sees climate and environment as crucial issues in its mission to build the peacebuilding field. There is a very clear interconnected relationship between environmental drivers of insecurity, climate change, and violent conflict, and the data on this is very evident. Complex problems require similarly complex and informed solutions. And I do want to shout out the Institute for Economics and Peace, who is a trailblazer in terms of publishing incisive, digestible, and actionable data on key peace and conflict trends throughout its reports and indices like the Global Terrorism Index and the Global Peace Index. Without this data, there cannot be smarter peace-building policies and programs, and we're really grateful to IEP for their work. Now, typically, if I give remarks on this issue or I'm writing a blog or a proposal, I referenced the 2022 Ecological Threat Report, but today I'm really excited to dive into some fresh findings from the just released 2023 report, among a lineup of distinguished speakers that we have today who are working at the nexus of environment, climate, and conflict. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Celestine Proctor. Celestine is an AFP Senior Fellow for Conflict, Environment, and Peacebuilding, who will moderate today's conversation and introduce our panelists. So Celestine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. So welcome, to echo what Nick said, welcome to today's session. Yeah, we're very excited to be introducing this 4th edition of the Ecological Threat Register. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I just wanted to provide a very brief overview on this fairly large undertaking, and it's quite an achievement. So just to run through some statistics, this report analyzes ecological threats in 221 independent states and territories. It's produced by the Institute of Economics and Peace, and it covers 3,594 subnational areas and accounts for 99.9% of the world's population. It assesses threats related to 4 areas: food insecurity, water risk, natural disasters, and demographic pressures. It analyzes the threats at the national, subnational, and city level, and it considers threats against societal resilience and levels of peace through its application of the Positive Peace Index. In doing this, it aims to refine the debate on the links between ecological change and peacefulness. It also suggests how societies can create resilience through building positive peace and using systems analysis approaches to understand those contexts. So, with that very brief overview, our guests today are Michael Collins from IEP, Daniel Abrams from USAID, and Dorothy Mazecki from the I knew I would get that one wrong. Apologies, the ANCA. And I will hand over to Michael.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Celestine, and welcome everyone. And it's a pleasure, as always, to be able to have these discussions and to present alongside Alliance for Peacebuilding, one of our core partners, not only in Washington, D.C., but around the world as well. So I'd love to go ahead and share my screen very briefly here. And both Nick and Celestine were tremendously kind as it pertained to the Institute. We are a nonprofit think tank, and we're dedicated essentially to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible, and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. We're most well known for the Global Peace Index and our research around positive peace. But for a number of years now, we've been sort of noting this close correlation that exists between increasing ecological threats and conflict. So for the past 4 years now, we've been issuing a separate complementary report called the Ecological Threat Report. The first edition was called the Ecological Threat Register. There was a variation in the name, now called the Ecological Threat Report. And as Celestine kindly introduced, we aim to cover most of the countries around the world. In this instance, being able to cover over 220 countries, 3,500 administrative units globally. And again, through core measures of food insecurity, water stress, population growth, and natural disasters as well, all seen through the lens of resilience and conflict. So this report is now freely available online for anyone who would love to delve into the detail. One small plug that I wanted to make, and I didn't really find the right place to plug this throughout the presentation, was that this is the first time that we've actually started to use some machine learning for covering some of or imputing some of the data gaps that we would see at subnational level in instances, for example. So it's very much exploratory at this phase, but we very much look forward to expanding that and to using new technologies to be able to leverage new indicators and analyze those in innovative ways in the future. This is the worst way to sort of start a presentation with a scatter plot like this, but it does kind of sort of really ram home this point about, you know, the connection or the correlation that exists between these increasing ecological threats and conflict. So you can imagine every dot that you see here as being essentially a country, and it's mapped according to its vulnerability or the current levels of, say, food insecurity and water stress, and its level of peacefulness. On the left-hand side is the level of peacefulness. The higher the number, the less peaceful the country is. So as you can see, the correlation is strong. And it is quite linear in this sense. Of course, the devil is in the detail, right? This is very much in terms of global averages. What you can do then, though, is that you can take out individual indicators and you can compare those. And it enables you to be able to see a whole other series of stuff. So, for example, all things being equal, we're able to see how a 25% increase in something like water scarcity, for example, leads to an 18% increase in conflict. A similar increase in exposure or vulnerability to natural disasters results in an increase of 21% increase in conflict. And moreover, for food insecurity, a 25% increase in food insecurity, which corresponds, at least as it pertains to the index, in a going from a 2 to a 3, for example, or for a 3 to a 4, results in a 36% increase in conflict. Now, again, those numbers are kind of sort of quite specific, and one does need to sort of take them in context. Nuance is key. Number one, these numbers specifically are based on global scores and globally available data. If you're able to sort of go down to a single country or a certain region, you can do a lot more analysis to be able to unpack this a whole lot more. Another thing to consider, of course, is the resilience component that Celestine also mentioned there. There's a number of countries that, for example, have exposure to these different threats, but nonetheless have high levels of resilience to be able to deal with them. There are other countries that have relatively low levels of resilience and therefore much more likely that ecological threats or increasing ecological threats are going to result in more conflict. This is everything that the Ecological Threat Report aims to unpack. So unpacking this and perhaps taking a step back and just looking at it from an indicator perspective, this is the population living in areas with severe food insecurity. So severe food insecurity, as it pertains to the report, is over 65% of the population not being able to afford food within a 1-year period. Now, as you can see, food insecurity generally is expected to increase, namely in the regions that you see here on the left-hand side. It is already significantly higher in sub-Saharan Africa and will be increasing significantly over the next 30 years. So currently over 1 billion people already have subject to high levels of food insecurity, 85% of the population in areas in sub-Saharan Africa. As it pertains to water risk specifically, so there are 46 countries that currently face severe water shortages or water stress. So severe in the Ecological Threat Report means that 20% of the population or more does not have access to clean drinking water. So that currently applies to just over 2 billion people globally. And a larger percentage of people lack, for example, access to safe sanitation. And the connotation here is that that can have an impact on the access to safe drinking water in the future as well. Now, interestingly, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and South America are the three regions that currently have the highest levels of water scarcity. But in 2040, the MENA region is due to have the same level of water scarcity than Sub-Saharan Africa, and Europe in many ways will start to suffer very high levels of water scarcity as well. So we already see significant issues with water in the southern band of Europe, but also in Eurasia, in a lot of the stands in Tajikistan in particular, for example. A lot of the water that is already available is currently being used. So the number of countries that are using a very large percentage of their water is increasing, as you can see here, from 17 to 25. Now, in Eurasia, for example, there's a significant amount of agriculture. A lot of water is currently being used for that. Now, as, when, and if water scarcity increases, it is natural to be able to natural to see this increase in the need to control resources. So things like damming, for example, will become much more important and significant, and with the potential knock-on effects of that already visible with the damming of the Mekong and the damming of the Nile, for example. This is the indicator related to natural disasters. And I put this up in terms of a map because it is quite granular subnationally, as you can see here. So this is the likelihood. A severe score in natural disasters would mean that there's over an 8% likelihood in any given year that a natural hazard will occur affecting more than 5% of the population. And then lastly, demographic pressure, the fourth indicator on the Ecological Threat Report. And important to note that of course, and we'll be exploring this in a tiny bit more detail, how all of these different indicators feed off each other. And conflict can create ecological threats, and ecological threats can create conflict as well. So with demographic pressure, rapid population growth, it's very much the same. So broadly speaking, the global population is due very much to increase. A lot of the countries where population is going to be increasing the most are already countries that are suffering from higher levels of poverty, even from conflict as well. The 40 least peaceful countries, for example, will constitute half of the world's population by 2050, with all of the challenges that follow. Sub-Saharan Africa's population specifically will increase significantly over that time. But we have seen more broadly that rates around the world are stabilizing or declining. And we do expect to see that in Sub-Saharan Africa, although that will be over the much longer term. So a lot of the challenges that we're referring to today are very much live and need to be addressed. Other parts of the world, though, we are already seeing this transition to either a stable or a contractionary population curve in places like South Korea, for example, currently beneath the replacement rate. Now, kind of sort of connecting the dots between the two last indicators that I mentioned, the natural disasters and demographic pressure. Of course, when there is major displacement, that creates a demographic pressure as well. When people are displaced by either disaster or conflict, most of the people are either displaced internally. Most people try and travel as little as they possibly can. Some people are displaced. 60–70% of people are displaced within 500 kilometers approximately of where they were originally from. Now, the number of displaced people around the world has continued to significantly increase, of course. And interestingly, one of the things that we see is that with regards to people who are displaced, they are often displaced in places that don't necessarily have lower levels of risk than the place that they were. So from memory, 28% of people who are displaced move to a country that has a higher natural disaster risk than the country that they were coming from. 22% go to a country that has a higher water risk percentage than the country that they were from, and 18 come from a country that, go to a country that has a higher food security risk. And then lastly, 9% go to a country that has a, 9% goes to a country that has a higher likelihood of conflict as well. So oftentimes we're seeing that countries, can be directly, not only do people who are displaced continue to be a significant risk, but also other countries that have low levels of resilience and have their own issues have that additional pressure of displacement and migration as well. Now, an aggravating factor perhaps is that a large part of not only the displaced population, but also the national population is continuing to make that migration towards cities. So as you can see here, globally, we're seeing a decrease in the amount of population living in rural areas, but that increase in urban areas is still expected to increase. There's a specific section this year in the Ecological Threat Report on megacities. Megacities are referred to cities that are either 10 million people or more. And whereas in the 1950s, there were 2-3 megacities, Tokyo and New York, I think were perhaps the only ones at the time. That has significantly increased around the world. And currently 33, going to at least 50 by 2050. Now, a lot of these cities are in countries that have high exposure to ecological threats, relatively low levels of resilience, and in some instances, low levels of peacefulness as well. So 2 countries with the most megacities, as you can see here, with the highest growth, highest population growth, lowest per capita income, and lowest social resilience are in Nigeria and the DRC. So that would be Kinshasa and Lagos in this particular case. And here is just another scatter plot showing, in this instance, megacities with their population compared to their actual GDP. Now, the reason for this comparison is because a lot of a country's development, a lot of a megacity's development and infrastructure is going to be very much based on tax revenue. So GDP is essentially somewhat of a proxy for that. So we see, for example, that 3 countries in India currently have low level of GDP per capita. India specifically isn't currently subject to significant population growth in the way that Kinshasa and Lagos would be, but nonetheless do have exposure to a variety of other ecological threats, for example. So taking another step back and kind of sort of throwing all of these different indicators and ecological threats together, we see that there are over 66 countries currently have a severe score, which basically means that in one of these indicators, it scores severely within that particular country. Nearly just about 45% of countries either score high or severe in ecological threats. Now, one of the things to note, and I mentioned at the beginning, is that nuance is key. You can have this exposure, but if you have relatively high levels of resilience, it enables you to be able to deal with it to a degree. So right now, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., just to the north of Florida, a place, for example, where there's a significant amount of floodings and hurricanes these days on a relatively annual basis. Nonetheless, the United States has high levels of positive peace, high measures of resilience that enable institutions, populations to be able to respond to these forms of crisis and to be able to adapt accordingly. Now, that's not necessarily always going to be the case because resilience always does take a hit when these things happen. In fact, measures of positive peace in the United States have been deteriorating for a number of years now. But the point is that you have changes, ecological changes. Of course, a lot of this, and there is a reason that we're launching the Ecological Threat Report today, and that's because it's a month before COP, which is one of the major annual meetings related to the impact and responses to climate change. So as a country is subject to an ecological shock, for example, that has an impact. The country responds according to its level of resilience. And if that level of resilience is low, it then inhabilitates the country's ability to be able to respond, creating future ecological threats, increasing, for example, food insecurity or water stress, which then again chips away at societal resilience. The main point here is that underlying societal resilience is going to be key to be able to meet a lot of the increasing ecological threats that we see. So with that in mind, another thing that we do through the Ecological Threat Report is to essentially map this exposure to the ecological threats that we've talked about today with underlying measures of resilience to be able to identify what we call subnational hotspots, which you can see here, and you can see sort of further disaggregated in the report. These are sort of the 30 countries that have very high or are exposed to it, have severe exposure to at least one of the ecological threats we discussed today, and also have very low levels of positive peace. Some of these countries may be the usual suspects, for lack of a better word. Some of them may not be. I mentioned Tajikistan, for example, may not be immediately on everyone's radar. There's a number of countries. There's a small section that we have in the report that's about a just transition and the transition away from fossil fuels. There's a number of countries here that would struggle significantly with that because such a high degree of their GDP is based on income or revenue from fossil fuels. So Iraq, Libya, South Sudan, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, for example, are all countries that may struggle in that way. Equatorial Guinea is quite notable. We don't talk about it a lot. It's got a very small population, but that has a significant positive peace deficit as we speak, meaning that current levels of peacefulness are slightly higher than what you would expect to see for its levels of positive peace. Now, we are able to kind of sort of, continue to break this down. And of course, there's many different things that you can consult both in the report and on the website dedicated to the Ecological Threat Report. But we just wanted to highlight out of the 103 subnational areas that face severe threats to all 4 domains, here are sort of the 4 worst subnational areas by population, namely within Niger and Ethiopia. So this kind of sort of starts to give us a sense of, in terms of international responses or even sovereign responses, where are the potential areas that we can be focusing on. It's not to say that it's the only issue, of course not, but especially when it comes to environmental resilience and sustainability and conservations program, leveraging either government funds or private sector funds. These are distinct areas that can be looked at. So in summary, and I do realize that I'm extending somewhat, and if I hadn't made the point before, I'd love to make it now, that without concerted international action, these levels of ecological degradation that we're seeing are going to continue to become substantially worse. Current conflicts, as we would see through something like the Global Peace Index, for example, will continue to increase and create further global insecurity. And as we saw through that kind of sort of vicious cycle, continue to exacerbate a range of social issues. The amount of people living in countries with high levels of ecological threats is going to continue to increase, at least for the next 30 years. Over 1 billion people already living in areas facing severe food insecurity. And let's not forget that as a percentage, this was kind of sort of the indicator that really leads the way in terms of predicting to a certain extent an increase in conflict. Sub-Saharan Africa is going to face the biggest challenges. We've delved into that quite a bit here. Nearly 2/3 of the 30 hotspot countries that you saw in that table beforehand are currently in Sub-Saharan Africa. Dar es Salaam would be, so in addition to Kinshasa, Lagos, Dar es Salaam, I was trying to think some of the other countries. Anyway, you'll be able to see the hotspot cities, megacities, included in the report as well. And then lastly, just to refer back again to this vicious cycle, and admitting openly that we are talking about some of the world's most intractable problems. Of course, these are incredibly complex and difficult things to unpack, not only to understand from a data-driven perspective, but more importantly, to be able to respond. It is invariably a whole series of different challenges and issues that face any nation when it comes to meeting future ecological threats. But we feel that it is not only important, but also necessary to simplify our approach in terms of creating integrated systems and focusing on resilience. So, countries with high levels of resilience are more likely to meet these ecological challenges. Places like Europe, for example, for the most part, will muddle their way through when it comes to this. Countries with low levels of resilience will not be able to. So this focus on resilience is absolutely key. And we do feel that there continues to be a lot of stovepiping, a lot of kind of sort of lack of integrated programming in a variety of different ways, whether that's within or outside of government. If we think about the UN resident coordinator system, for example, which is actually set up, right, to be able to kind of sort of integrate different programs. Invariably, programs are still going off in their own ways, and there aren't centralized mechanisms. The same could be said, for example, for the cluster system in the humanitarian context. There is a certain organization working on education. Yes, education contributes to resilience. Great, thumbs up. And another organization is working on rule of law, contributes to resilience. Yes, thumbs up. But the core critical component here is actually focusing on resilience and then determining what it is you're going to work on from there, rather than starting from the inside and working in. So if that would be one sort of ongoing recommendation, that would be what we would have. And I very much look forward to hearing the thoughts of the panel.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a very brief, but for overview for a very detailed report. So we thought now that we'll move on to questions from our panelists. And Daniel, I'll start with you. And our first question is, you're at the forefront of integrating climate and conflict within US government's development assistance efforts. In the spring of 2022, USAID released its climate strategy, which notes the compounding relationship between climate change and violent conflict. Now we're a year and a half out from the release of that strategy. How is it being implemented, and how much climate program funding is integrating into conflict prevention programming?
Yeah, great question. And let me start by saying thanks for having me, and congratulations to Michael and team for a really excellent report. To your question, in terms of how the climate strategy is being implemented, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that, as Administrator Power has made clear, USAID is a climate change agency. And what that means, in effect, is that everything that we are doing across geographies, across sectors, necessitates an integration of climate change adaptation and mitigation in some manner. So whether that's focusing on mobilizing climate finance for critical populations, or ensuring equitable distribution of climate finance, or thinking about how we can leverage climate change as a shared challenge that we can use in our peacebuilding work, it's going to touch all sectors. And conflict, in my view, it's no different, in the sense that the way we are thinking about climate change and conflict necessitates moving away from only considering climate change as a threat multiplier, and thinking about the way these systems overlap. And I think that was made really clear in the report, which notes that by 2050, we're looking at 2.8 billion people facing severe ecological threats and security challenges. And if we were to bring that down to a very local level, to a particular farmer in a particular place, their reality is they are dealing with both challenges at once. And for an organization like USAID, that means figuring out ways to meet them where they are, and whether that means integrating our climate work into our conflict portfolio, or our conflict portfolio into our climate concerns. It's really the same question in a different frame. And I think the final point I'll make here is that notion is well reflected in this report, because I think what you see pointed out is that the drivers of vulnerability to climatic or ecological shocks are very similar, in fact, mirrored quite closely by what makes people vulnerable to security or conflict-related shocks.
Thank you, Daniel. So to follow on from that question, then, how is USAID cooperating with other agencies? And you mentioned it slightly in your last answer, but what other agencies are you coordinating with in these efforts? What does that look like in terms of multilateral partners? And then what are the main challenges and successes that you've had in that coordination effort in this space?
Yeah, so I would say this is an active community of practice within the US government, that are a number of ways, both formally and informally, in which we come together, whether that's through formal convenings by the White House, or whether that's through informal coordination. And I'll just give an example. Recently, the State Department's Conflict Stabilization Office, in partnership with the U.S. Institute of Peace, hosted a number of us, along with the NSC, I should say as well, hosted a number of different agencies, both in the development space, in the diplomatic space, and in the scientific space, to understand what are our shared equities in addressing climate change as a conflict risk, and addressing climate change as a national security risk. So utilizing applied exercises and some really thoughtful convening of workshops, we really worked through a number of problems and where each organization was best suited to address them. So that'd be one example. And I think I would also be remiss not to raise the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, better known as PREPARE, which is oriented around making 500 million people more resilient to climate change. And USAID is central to that. And so what PREPARE does is first give people information that can save their lives and their livelihoods. So providing climate information, climate forecasts at different scales. So close partnership here with scientific agencies like NOAA and NASA. Thinking about how we can plan and mitigate for the effects of climate impacts that we know are coming. So investing in ways to increase food security and in increasing agricultural production, and also ensuring that we are properly engaging the private sector by leveraging climate finance. So those are really, these are interagency, these require close collaboration, and are central for how we think about responding to ecological and security threats.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So I'll move on to our final question for you, Daniel. With the complexities laid out in the Ecological Threat Register, what is referred to as the nexus for interrelated challenges that calls for multi-sectoral responses, or at least multi-sectoral indicators built into any potentially any type of programming? How do you see this changing the US government's approach to development aid?
So just to clarify, the question is, how do I see the multi-sectoral risks of ecological threats and conflict changing the US government's approach to aid more generally?
Yeah, the fact that it's much more multi-sectoral in nature in terms of response and indicators. How do you see that reflecting in the USG's approach to development aid?
Yeah, so I think in some respects, thinking about these issues is a hard thing to do in an agency where there's a lot of limitations of how, or sectorally, the way funds are spent. However, returning to an earlier point, the drivers of ecological risk and the drivers of conflict risk are really similar. And if we think about what USAID's core mission is, and if we think about like a very typical challenge, one that's outlined in the report, would be food security. The two biggest drivers in the world right now of food insecurity are climate change and conflict separately. We have any number of tools to understand that and to respond to that as a joint challenge. I think it's a matter of increasing our ability to do good climate change work in conflict contexts. And I think it's a matter of understanding what happens when these two issues come together. So drawing upon resources like the Ecological Threat Report, or thinking about work that we're doing internally, something like FuseNet, which tracks these issues closely, enables us to identify intervention points. And I think the final point that I'll raise here is that USAID, under the direction of the administrator, is really emphasizing localization. And the closer we can bring our responses to the organizations and the people that are dealing very acutely with these challenges, the better off it's going to be in terms of how effective this programming is. So this doesn't require a wholesale change by any stretch, but speaks to the core questions that USAID is working on.
Thank you, Daniel. That's very much appreciated. So Dorothy, moving on over to you. This year's edition of the Ecological Threat Register found that not all ecological threats are per se driven by climate change. For instance, recent analysis of conflict around Lake Chad has argued that political mismanagement of water resources rather than changes in the lake itself are the cause of conflict. How do you see this playing out in your work in Kenya?
Yeah, so let me start by saying, when Michael was making that presentation, you saw that slide on sub-Saharan Africa. Not very interesting because that's the unfortunate reality that we are in from Africa. Now, just to briefly just say one or two things about the African Natural Capital Alliance, basically, which you called ANCA, is basically a collaborative forum of, institutions who've come together to address the nature challenge, and to address the nature challenge from a financial systems point of view, to address the nature challenge, and in this case, I'd say nature stroke ecological challenge, by putting nature at the heart of strategy and decision making. So a report like this is very useful to Alliance members who are made up of banks, insurance companies, a couple of government agencies, a number of international development organizations, etc. And a report like this is very good, basically to provide the context within which either projects can be developed, project can be taken off the ground, and basically to provide a solution, a good background for relevant financial solutions to be put to be put to work. So congratulations, Michael and team, for this report. Now, just before I talk about those challenges that you've talked about, wanted to mention that if you look at the report, drought in the Horn of Africa has displaced nearly 2 million people in Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Somalia. Now, 200,000 of these people are crossing into borders into similarly drought-stricken areas, including Kenya. If you look at what Michael presented in terms of the population growth, around estimated rise of about 60% by 2050, under 15-year-olds are projected to be greater than the entire population of Europe by 2050. We've talked about water stress. We've talked about 200 million people dependent on the Nile. We've also talked about these mega cities, Nigeria and DRC. Now, specifically in answering your questions, how do we see this playing out in Kenya, where it's not so much driven by climate change, but more ecological threats are not so much driven by climate change, but political mismanagement of water resources. I want to give an example of Kenya. So access to water resources in Kenya, we have access to water resources like lakes, rivers, and we have a big agricultural and industrial use of this water. Mismanagement of these resources, of course, causes disputes among different users. So you have farmers, you have pastoralists, you have urban communities who are also reliant on this water and competing for the very limited resources that can into conflict. We have transboundary water conflicts. So Kenya also shares several transboundary water bodies with a number of countries. So we have Lake Victoria, which we share with Uganda and Tanzania. We have Lake Turkana. We have rivers like the Tana, and you find that it's not so much that there are challenges. Of course, climate change is a big challenge, but there could be conflicts and disputes with neighboring countries, for example, where these communities or these neighboring communities have not agreed on certain things, or where policies on resource sharing are not too clear. I'll give an example where for a while there have been challenges with regards to fishing within the Lake Victoria in a certain region in one of the islands. And what happens is you find fishermen from Kenya going to that island to fish, and the neighboring country arresting them. So you find a lot of conflict when it comes to such examples. Again, of course, drought and water scarcity, like many African countries, we are facing recurring challenges of drought and water scarcity, and where there's mismanagement of water resources. For example, inadequate infrastructure for water storage. It's a paradox. So you find there are challenges in water scarcity, but then you also find there's flooding. So the question is, when it rains so much that there's flooding, then what happens with that water? So if the inadequate infrastructure for water storage, of course, inadequate distribution, allocation, etc., can lead to conflicts, because these communities don't have access to drinking water, irrigation, livestock. And I want to say that even urban communities can be affected and are affected by water shortage. So solutions for this, of course, include building of sand dams. If you look at the report, there's a good analysis that has been put in terms of the cost of building one sand dam, and basically the benefits that leads to, which again, one entity has actually built about 30 dams over quite a short period of time. So that is also a key aspect. So I just want to mention maybe one last one in terms of land use conflicts. So again, land use practices, deforestation, urbanization. We talked about migration from rural areas to urban areas, of course, contributes to changes in hydrology and impacts water sources. So basically, Kenya, like other regions, can benefit from one, improved governance. A lot has been done to just manage resources more effectively. Of course, there's still a lot more that can be done, especially among more of the rural societies and those border countries or border towns. Better regulatory frameworks. Community involvement is key. And then basically just sustainable resource management practices to ensure, good well-being of the population, political will, sound policies, and collaboration of all stakeholders.
Thank you, Dorothy, for that. So just to follow on from that, what do you think makes for good coordinated resource management between urban areas and rural areas in order to prevent the outbreak of violence and conflict?
I want to say that this basically requires a very comprehensive and inclusive approach. And there are certain principles that this approach should be premised upon. Principles of equity, will everybody get access? Principles of sustainability, be it in for financial solutions that are put about to manage resources or to enhance resilience, are they sustainable? So if, for example, you've had, donor organizations putting up dams or digging boreholes, then what happens when these donors leave? And so just ways within which to make some of these projects sustainable, and of course, inclusivity. So I think one of the key ones would be more of collaborative governance, establishing mechanisms for collaboration, for dialogue between urban and rural areas. Like I said, there's also that conflict. You find there's need to have joint committees. You find communities, including urban communities, where there are forums, there are councils, where stakeholders from both areas, especially when you're talking about urban-rural conflict, coming together to make decisions. Of course, policies and regulations, I can't, overemphasize on that. Conflict resolution is key, especially when you're talking about, cases where, say, a rural community borders a more urban areas in a different country, or an urban area bordering a rural community in a border country. Again, establishing conflict resolution mechanisms, mediation, arbitration, whatever means, whether it is community engagements, etc. Infrastructure development is also big, and from where I sit, because of course I'm in finance, so investment in infrastructure that benefits both urban and rural areas. And this development could be in terms of, water. In this case, we're talking about water. It could be in terms of, energy infrastructure, because you need either electricity, whether solar or whichever renewable power to, pump this water. You need transportation networks, including where water has to be moved from one place to the other. Maybe not, because possibly no piping has been done. And this is largely where finance comes in. This is where private-public partnerships come in, to see how this development can actually be done better. And then just finally, local empowerment and resource sharing agreements would come out key as. Am I still on?
Yes, you are, Dorothy.
You froze for a bit, but you're here. Yeah. I think it was just a little glitch. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you, because you cut out the end. I wasn't sure if you had finished.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for that. So we'll move on to some questions that have come in the chat now. I think starting, Michael, with you, a couple of questions have been posed around how you define societal resilience and what indicators do you use for that?
Sure. So the basis that we use for resilience actually started with the Global Peace Index. So if you think of the Global Peace Index as a measure of peacefulness, what it essentially does is it looks at things like violent crime, homicide, a variety of different indicators related to violence. Now, that enables us to be able to identify and look at countries that have higher measures of peace. In other words, where there is lower homicides, where there's less violent crime, where there are less terrorist incidents and attacks, where there's a lower degree of militarization, for example. Via that and that identification of countries that are peaceful or becoming more peaceful, we can run statistical analysis to be able to better understand the underlying socioeconomic factors that create and sustain peace. So one of the frameworks that emanates from that work and the over 500 indicators that we see actually share that close statistical correlation is called our positive peace framework. And we simplify it to the nth degree by presenting it through what we call the 8 pillars of positive peace. So these countries that have higher measures of peacefulness and resilience, right? Countries that are better able to respond to crisis of any kind, whether that be COVID-19 or a natural disaster or even an economic crisis for that matter, tend to have a well-functioning government, an equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, higher levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and a sound business environment. We use a variety of 24 different indicators to track that on an annual basis through our Positive Peace Report, which I'd be delighted which I'm delighted to promote and to plug here. That is kind of sort of the basis for the resilience measure that we use. And if you don't mind me building on that very quickly, it really speaks in many ways to what Dorothy was just talking about, right? When it comes to building resilience, all of the different factors that need to be considered systemically to be able to build that over time.
Thank you, Michael. Daniel, there's a question in the chat that's been posed around, is the US government using local resilience capacity and knowledge to increase community resilience? I wonder if you might be able to share some responses on that.
Yeah, I think coming back to my remarks earlier, if you think about the push on localization, that's ultimately the question. How individuals define their own resilience, how communities at as local scale as possible define their own resilience needs to be part of the equation. So I think especially from USAID's perspective, and I couldn't speak to the US government at large, but it is imperative to bring those local voices to the fore to advance our goals as a development agency. So absolutely.
Thank you, Daniel. And Dorothy, the report provides some interesting examples for innovative development that connects carbon credits with community-based initiatives. This connection between carbon credits or potential carbon finance, conflict management, and sustainable development has both pros and cons. What do you think some of the challenges are that might arise from this type of intervention? And what does this mean for regulation and policy?
That's a very good question. So unfortunately, especially in conflict-prone areas, carbon credits and community-based initiatives can actually be a double-edged sword. So have the potential of bringing about positive environmental and social impacts, economic impacts also, but there are several challenges, and concerns. So one has to do with the land and resource rights disputes. Carbon projects obviously many times involve land use changes, for example, afforestation or reforestation, and these changes could lead to disputes over land and resource rights, especially in regions where there are unclear land tenure systems in Africa, for example, or where marginalized communities depend on their land for livelihoods. So how then are they compensated, or how then do they share in the benefits? Again, touching on that inequitable benefit distribution, and in some places, sometimes it's called benefit sharing arrangements, basically ensuring that benefits from carbon credit projects reach local communities can be challenging. It is unfortunate that without adequate regulation, without adequate policies, there's a risk that financial gains primarily benefit either project developers, investors, or the numerous intermediaries or verifiers in between. And so communities may not directly benefit. And that is again now leads into that vicious cycle where now communities begin to reject these carbon projects, begin to get into conservancies where maybe they had agreements on certain things. They now begin to get in there and basically begin to have very major challenges with project developers. And we've seen in some instances, including in my own country, some of these carbon projects being cancelled. Of course, then there is the whole aspect of additionality. So how do you ensure that a project is additional? And that can be challenging because some projects may simply seek carbon credits for activities that could have happened anyway. And then maybe one last thing, because of course I focus on nature. How do these carbon credits also ensure that ecosystems are preserved? Also ensure that there are biodiversity benefits that come about, because a carbon project does not necessarily, some carbon projects do not necessarily have biodiversity co-benefits. So the regulatory and policy gaps are also a big challenge, and if underdeveloped, then can create lack of accountability, can create disputes, and it just becomes a big challenge. And so regulation and policy is very important for this component.
Thank you, Dorothy. Michael, so there's another question that's been posed around that there's a vicious cycle between ecological damage and conflict context sometimes allow for that dark side of globalization, for example, trafficking, illicit movement of people, animals, minerals, wood products. Does the index take those into account?
So number one, yes, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, when we think of it in terms of as and when different, so the short answer is no, the Ecological Threat Register doesn't, right? So it doesn't necessarily take those elements into account. What it does is it provides a measure of what are the current levels of, say, food insecurity and water stress within a particular region, and then connects that back with a subsequent increase in or a countermeasure of resilience. Now, weakened institutions, right, or the lack of strong institutions, which is a core measure of resilience or lack of, is very much a breeding ground for the kind of activities that you are talking about. And one of the core dangers here is that as and when natural resources become more scarce, the control of those particular geographical areas is going to become a lot more paramount, both for states and the likelihood that they are going to impinge upon local communities and strip resources or even land from local communities, or alternative from non-state actors or militant organizations. So, for example, if you look at some of the details of the upcoming Global Terrorism Index, a lot of terrorist organizations, 50% of the violence that terrorist organizations commit essentially are more over the control of resources that then, bring in the revenue to be able to fund their activities rather than their ideological purposes themselves. So one of the critical dangers here is, again, as these ecological threats continue to increase, that we are unfortunately probably going to see a lot more of the elements that you're referring to here.
Thank you, Michael. So this is quite a long question, sorry. Do you consider, so Michael, I think this one's probably again for you. Do you consider that the current global planning efforts, for example, the IPCC, the Project Drawdown, deep decarbonization pathways project, will resolve the global warming effect? None of these ensure proper integrated systems analysis, including the topic of this webinar. Those analysis must be done to have such a focus. I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm not sure if there is a question there.
It's all right. I can see it up here on the screen. Thanks,
okay.
Thanks, Celestine. So, I'm familiar with a lot of these projects in name mostly, so I can't sort of opine as to the quality of one to the other, and it wouldn't necessarily be my place or level of expertise. But in short, yes, I do think that there is a need, even much more broadly than these programs, to address the issue or to adopt integrated programming a lot more effectively. And if these particular initiatives are doing it, then that's fantastic, and it's definitely something that can and should be expanded. Again, it's not necessarily easy, and especially when it comes to multilateral initiatives, when it comes to very large development agencies of all ilks and from all countries, it is very much kind of sort of like a steamship, and it's kind of sort of difficult to move direction. Plus, a lot of donors to this day really struggle with the idea of adaptive programming. There's been an increase in, say, trust-based philanthropy, for example, but fundamentally, any donor, whether that's an individual, an organization, or alternatively a country, they want to know where their money is going to go to before they actually give it. And that's kind of sort of very natural. But one of the challenges there is that it supposes an immediate obstacle to the kind of sort of, systemic integrated programming components that we're talking about, because the premise is that you don't really know what to touch until you start tweaking things. So you can't give a very long laundry list of exactly all of the things that you're going to do, because by the time you've done one thing and you've seen that it's had this impact, you need to change it and do something else, or you need to pivot. So I think that there's going to need to be a fundamental change in the way that we not only engage in philanthropy and development, but more importantly, especially when it comes to integrating the private sector, doing it in a way that's very much based on the systems that you mentioned here.
Could I just add to that response? I think what comes out key, if reading the projects that have been highlighted, they're largely climate change related projects. When you talk about the IPPC, you talk about the International Energy Agency, I think it's International IEA. It's basically to do with climate change issues. And I think part of what is very key from this report is that ecology has a direct link with peace and with conflict and all those things. Now, you cannot talk about ecology or talk about anything to do with the environment and nature as it is without talking about climate, because actually all these things that we're talking about, forests, water, etc., are said to contribute almost a third of the climate mitigation efforts that are required by 2050. And so there's a very clear linkage between each of these components. And I agree with the chart, the comment on the chart, that more studies need to be done on this, more integration. I think just as this topic and this report has clearly highlighted the interrelationship between, this topic, that needs to be fully extended into all these, should I call them global stock take ideas that are really ideally trying to address the climate change challenge.
Now I would like to jump in on this one because I think Dorothy raised some really important points, as did Michael. And the question's an important one. I think it's an interesting one, especially as Dorothy put, sort of the ones oriented around climate change. For example, there's been a number of articles that question the relevance of the IPCC, which has more or less been telling us the same things year in, year out, that require action that hasn't necessarily happened. And something that I was thinking about, Michael, as you were giving your presentation, was the scale of change of social and political and conflict-related factors are happening at a remarkable rate. And so this is the 4th edition, is that right, of the Ecological Threat Report? So if you think about the volume of change that has happened since 2020 or 2021, everything from recent events in the Middle East to recent events in Ukraine to COVID to remarkable upheaval in sub-Saharan Africa, I would be really curious to see how the analysis that you have done over time, if you were to take the data longitudinally that you've produced and examine it, what did we see? What didn't we see? What indicators could we be using? Because I think that presents a real opportunity for interesting analysis to both how policy levers are shifted and how agencies respond in real time, and ultimately how we understand these issues. Especially because the way that a lot of these challenges will play out aren't going to be confined only to the spaces in which you have the climate shocks, right? There's factors that connect all of these different risks across borders. So I think the question raised is a good one, and I appreciate both responses, but would also parlay that into, Michael, how do we take the total scope of what you've done or what your team has done and really learn from that?
So I think that's fantastic, Daniel, and that is very much an area in which we wanted to go ourselves. You know, the Ecological Threat Report, again, the fourth year is kind of sort of very much in its infancy in many ways. We've been doing like the Global Peace Index for 16 years now, and that is kind of sort of a product or a report that kind of sort of improves over time as and when we can leverage more indicators and we can do this analysis. And these kind of sessions specifically, and all of the questions that we've received today, really help us kind of sort of, you know, pin in exactly what are the directions that we'd like to move in next. The short answer is yes, absolutely. We do feel that it's very useful to be able to retain peace as an anchor, because peace or the lack of peace is kind of sort of what happened, is the ultimate outcome, right? Is when nothing has been able to be resolved, whatever the cause was, whatever the consequence was. So that is very helpful, but increasingly being able to look on, okay, well, what is the correlation and what comes about first to create that is absolutely critical. And even basic questions such as, okay, well, what has been the true peace building impact of a UN peacekeeping mission within a particular place, right? What has been the specific impact of a policy that has been adopted by these particular 4 countries or within this region? What has been the impact of the Global Fragility Act over an extended period of time, for example? All areas that from our perspective, we'd be very excited to meaningfully explore.
Thank you for your responses to that. There's a question in the chat on the youth focus, and I posed this question to all the panelists. The report has a strong focus on youth and the youth bulge, highlighting the likelihood that conflict will increase as the bulge increases. How can we leverage the data, this data, to create positive peace? And what do you think some of the best approaches might be to leverage youth in peace building programming? Perhaps, Michael, we can start with you and then move to Daniel and Dorothy.
Absolutely, and thank you for highlighting that section of the report. Yes, we will definitely continue to see a youth bulge, at least for the time being, in sub-Saharan Africa largely, although again, as a sort of a trend over an extended period of time, that bulge is set to decrease. We do, you know, statistically see a connection between youth bulges around the world and increases in conflict. Less so, in fact, we don't see a correlation with ethnic conflict, for example, but certainly in terms of social grievances, right? Youth are increasingly politically active and increasingly likely to express their dissatisfaction through a variety of means, and technology has facilitated that as well. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes that can be a really, really great thing, right? It gets to the issue of there essentially not being enough opportunity to merit people resorting to violence, or alternatively, for example, joining a militant or terrorist group. We also see a sort of a connection in that, an increase in terrorist activity in youth bulges. So with the aim of making sure that not only youth have opportunity, but they remain engaged, well, definitely political participation and that political activism is highly recommended, of course, but also, you know, taking a step back, yes, as peace builders, in fact, at IEP, we've got this extensive network of peace ambassadors that includes many, many different youth working on different peace building activities. You can think about healing ethnic divides between groups as kind of sort of a core or a, you know, an initial peace building activity, but let's not forget this underlying resilience factor, what creates and sustains peace. There is a distinct need. We have not been able to generate the solutions that we need to be able to build resilience and meet the upcoming ecological threats that we're going to see. So from an entrepreneurial perspective, there's a distinct opportunity for the youth as they can to become engaged in developing the new technologies and processes that we're going to need to get out of the situation that we're in.
I'll add very little to this, just to say, obviously, youth have the most to lose in both respects. And that energy and that passion needs to be considered and utilized. And I think the second thing is that there are situations where demography is going to make a difference to a context. And at the same time, we are seeing a youth bulge. There's also places where there's decreasing populations. There's also places where there is need for labor. There's also a lot of things happening at once, and I want to make sure we don't overgeneralize. And just one intervention I think is important, and one frame of mind is understanding that the decision to migrate, whether that's temporarily or permanently within a country or outside of it, needs to be understood as a very important means of climate change adaptation. And I think that is especially true with youth. And I think that there is potential for a lot of co-benefits for bridging different places together. And that we need to be sure to frame this not solely as a risk, but also as an opportunity.
I really want to segue into what Daniel you said, and I just want to requote you. You said there are places where demography will make a difference to a context. And I want to apply this from the African context. The report highlights that by 2015, under 15s would actually be, in Africa, would be around the population of Europe. Now, when you look at that and you're living in Africa, then it can be very scary. It basically means that we'll be fighting for resources. This youth need to eat, this youth need to work, youth need to, all those things. But at the same time, also leads, let me just switch off my camera just for my bandwidth, my apologies. But at the same time, this very same youth creates new opportunities for markets. And so Africa then becomes a big market for Europe and the US, and, big market for technology, big market for, medicine, so basically then it creates a new opportunity. And I think what the reports really goes to highlight just gives the context from different perspectives. And I think what speaks again to me is the fact that then it gives us the challenge to live a better world. No, we've always said live a better world for the upcoming generation, or live a better world for the coming youth. It's actually to live better youth for the world. Because at the end of the day, you need youth who understand that peace is important. You need youth who can protect and conserve the environment and the beauty of biodiversity. And so it basically goes into what can we do to train these youth? How can we get them when they're very young, even as they get into their youth? How can they be clear and aware of the need to enhance peace, to live together, the need to be responsible, so that then we leave a better youth for the world ahead of us.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I've just lost the question that I had. I'm cutting and pasting them into a different document. No, I've totally lost it. Let me go back to the... There's a question in the chat around, if ecology has a direct link with peace, how do we include intact ecological systems as a key pillar of the pillars of positive peace? I think that question's across, especially to Mike, starting with Michael and then linking to Dorothy and Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. And I see the question from Galeo, and it's not out of any lack of desire. So perhaps a couple of things to clarify as it pertains to positive peace. So positive peace, or the pillars of positive peace, are not based on what we assume creates an improvement in peacefulness, but rather what we can statistically show through the data that's available. Now, one of the ongoing challenges when it comes to, say, things like intact ecological systems and how that may currently, or a variety of ways in which that could be measurement, we're not altogether there. There are some interesting indicators that we're exploring around that we can then run against the measures of the Global Peace Index to be able to see statistically whether that correlation exists. In other words, whether an intact ecological system does lead to an improvement in peacefulness over time. We assume that to be true, but do we really do we really know? And you know, very, very happy for you to point us to research. Invariably, there's a lot of research that we're not familiar with, and we always make sure to integrate that and inform our thinking. So, for example, if you were to go back many hundreds of years, pre-industrialization, for example, you know, whether a more intact ecological system would have led or be leading to more or less conflict between the peoples of that time. We also have the situation in which, and I'm kind of sort of just trying to piece things together here in my mind, in which you would have societies that are relatively at a high state of peace, that are invariably very dense, and other societies that may have low levels of peacefulness, but actually, when you look at it as a country, which is where the measure would be, are relatively intact with regards to an ecological system. If you think of Guyana, for example, right? Over 90% of the population in Guyana is along a very small strip of coast on the north of the country. The rest of the country is completely forested, right? But nonetheless, it has comparatively low levels of peacefulness. So it is very difficult to be able to do that. And again, it's out of no lack of desire, and it's definitely something that we'll continue to explore. But again, we don't start with the supposition that we think that this does contribute. You know, we intuitively it kind of sort of makes sense. But then and sorry to go on about this, but it also raises a whole other lot of questions, right? Which I think are underlying some of that question, which is how much or how little right do current countries that are relying on fossil fuels, whether that is imported from another region, right, such as Europe, for example, or alternatively producing those fossil fuels as well. And how much right do we have to say, well, you know, you need to reduce your production of fossil fuels to be able to benefit the ecology? The important thing is going to be showing not only how, for example, an intact ecological system can improve peacefulness, should that be what the data shows, but importantly, how that transition can physically be made. And I think that is still an area that we consider to be a significant challenge.
Yeah, Michael, I just want to add on to what you've said. I think it's a very important topic and aspect or element. But to give just now an African example, the Congo Basin is home to the second largest rainforest in the world. And I saw in the Peace Index, Congo, we all know where it is in terms of peace. And so it's I guess what you're trying to say and what I'm trying to say is it's not necessarily directly proportional, and there's scope to further unpack it and further understand it, but totally agree with your sentiments, Michael.
Yeah, I think Michael covered it well, but my view is from sitting in a conflict office, you don't fully understand the conflict context until you understand the climate and environmental context. That is a piece of the puzzle. It is definitely not the sole driver, but it is always an important aspect that defines and is defined by the social and ecological realities. And that's a central point. And just looking at time, I don't want to go too much further into that.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I think the last question that I'll pose just before I hand back to Nick is there's a question related to the inclusion of both in the report and your organizations. Are you analyzing climate migrations and loss and damage? And I thought that was an interesting reflection ahead of COP28. So I posed that first to Michael, but also then to Daniel and Dorothy.
Yes, it's a good point, and I definitely think that there is an opportunity to explore that, and increasingly so. We already, for example, do track on an annual basis the economic cost of violence and conflict. And we're increasingly able to sort of unpack that under a variety of different kind of sort of dimensions and indicators. And I'm not entirely sure whether it's conceivable to actually physically do that as it pertains to climate change. I mean, one of the reasons that we talk about ecological threat, the reports, and one of the ecological threat report, and to Daniel's earlier point, is that although climate change, can act as an accelerator of these, a lot of these things are happening nonetheless. In short, right now, no, but definitely something that we'd love to work on in the future.
I would say, so I think on tracking migration, I think there's a lot of efforts to do that. It is very difficult for a lot of reasons, especially with IDPs as compared to refugees. And I think also if we open up the scope of what we mean by migration and include seasonal, non-permanent migration, it's a very challenging but very important thing to understand. And I would add to, at a very local level, if we're thinking about the risks of conflict that relate to climate change, often its relative abundance and movement in some degree is a common grounding factor there. So understanding those dynamics at a hyper-local scale, for example, I'm thinking about work that we've done in Kenya and in the Sahel is really important, in understanding how we can accommodate that. Again, not at a global scale, but at a very local scale is certainly something we're tracking and critically important.
I would like to confess that up until I connected with the Institute for Peace, the Institute, I'd never quite related peace with what I do in the context that the report has highlighted. And I'm lucky that I had the privilege of seeing an earlier version of the report before it's fully published. And I take that as a challenge because having looked at that report, then there's a very clear connection. And then more importantly, it's a piece of work that we would like to engage in, because again, when you talk about loss and damage, you're talking about vulnerable communities saying that, we need to be compensated. But then that's a deeper discussion, emotive discussion in this part of the world, I must say. But yes, we take up the challenge as the African Natural Capital Alliance.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, and thank you to the panelists. I will have I'll hand back to Nick for final comments.
Thank you, and I'll keep it super brief, but thank you, Celestine, for your moderation, and thank you, Michael, for your presentation, your report. I did drop the link to the report in the chat. I'll send it in a follow-up email as well to all who registered. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Dorothy. We've come at this issue from many different wonderful angles, and thank you for the participatory audience tonight, or this evening, afternoon, morning. We have people from all around the world attending, so we really appreciate your thoughtful questions, and they make the conversation more rich. So stay tuned for similar events and follow-up. We really look forward to those, and we're grateful for your participation. So I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their Wednesday. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Ciao.